Let me introduce you Tyler Talaga from MyFitnessPal, and he's gonna talk about low-code automation and app installers, a match made in efficiency heaven.
What's up, everybody? It's difficult to overstate exactly how stoked I am for you all to be here today. This is low-code automation and app installers. Sorry about the lengthy name. It's the best that ChatGPT could come up with. Good help is so hard to find, you know. So I'm Tyler Talaga, but if you get anywhere close with the last name, that's fine too. They called me Talladega for like 6 years at one job. So I'm the IT automation engineer for MyFitnessPal. Most of my experience actually comes from cybersecurity, but I was lured to the dark side last year in about spring. Been here ever since, having a great time. So I've had the pleasure of meeting some of you in person already, which has been great. Met many more over Slack. But in either case, it's a genuine pleasure for you all to be here today and to meet you. A couple quick housekeeping items. Number one, I also thought that I would be taller. You know, I decided to get all my growing out of the way in like freshman year of high school, and I was like, don't worry about the top shelf, it's never gonna come into play. So, and then the other housekeeping item is, what the heck is automation engineering? You might be like, Tyler, that sounds like a made up job, and I'm like, yeah, but all jobs are made up. So, but basically what an automation engineer does is we either examine an existing process or we create a brand new one. And we determine where in that process critical thinking actually needs to be injected, right? So where does a conscious human being need to sit in that process to throw a lever and say, yes, proceed, or stop, or take a different track. And then we look at the rest of the process and we decide how best to automate the rest of it. So if 1% can be done by a human being, the other should just be kind of relegated to scripts or automations or what have you. And by doing so, we kind of we act as a force multiplier. So a quick rundown of what we'll be covering today. We'll be taking a mile-high overview of how these automations work, their constituent parts, how they work together, major components of each, things like that. We're going to have a primer on Tines, which is a magnificent low-code automation platform. The barrier to entry is very, very low. I think you'll like it. I certainly do. We're going to then go on to have in-depth discussions about each automation and the high-level goal that each automation achieves. So first we'll be talking about detection and suggestion for app installers that are available from the Jamf Pro App Catalog, of course. We're going to figure out which ones aren't already deployed, because that would be redundant. And we're going to figure out which ones are actually worth deploying at all. Next, we're going to go ahead and configure and deploy those app installers. So creating our smart group, we're going to add the app installer from the catalog, we're going to configure it, and then finally we're going to enable it. And then finally we're going to talk about maintenance and patching, or basically maintenance of those app installers and getting the data to where it actually needs to go, right, for patch management. And then last but not least, code. I didn't say good code, but it does resemble code nonetheless. So basically, I didn't think that using Tines was a necessary prerequisite for making your lives easier, your processes more streamlined, or your environments more secure. So basically what I did was I took those Tines workflows that we have, I translated them into Python, and I put them in a GitHub repo. So you guys could take those and see how to interact with the app installer APIs, right? So by doing so, you don't necessarily have to use Tines. I do, we're very happy with it, but that's not necessary for you guys. If you just want to go with code, that's okay too. So I got on with MyFitnessPal back in spring of 2022, and my first assignment was patch management. This is a true fact. If you look up IT-related migraines and the causes of each in 2022, Patch management is number 2. Asset management is number 1. And that's 100% true according to a fact that I just made up. So you probably don't use that in your works cited, but so pertinent questions we had at the time for patch management were, what were we doing at the time? And what were the options using Jamf Pro? Because we were patching, but we needed to kind of standardize everything and get it to a state where it was documented. We had pilot and production groups, things like that. Pertinent objectives was, number 1, ensuring Mac OS remained up to date. And although that's out of scope for this discussion, we're going to talk about app installers, we also use Tines to do it as well. So we use like an API MDM driven flow. The next objective was ensuring applications, quote unquote, of concern remained up to date. And when I say of concern, that's going to vary by your org. One component of this criteria may be any application that essentially shortens the number of steps an attacker needs to take to reach your end user. So when you think about that, I often use browsers as an example. So let's talk about app installers. So they were available as of 10.3.7 as a preview feature for Jamf Pro Cloud customers. And essentially, if you aren't familiar with app installers already, they're essentially a curated catalog of Jamf managed and Jamf provided installer packages, right? They're a fantastic solution for automatically updating in-scope applications. You can technically use them as well for the initial deployment, but you have less control doing that. I have seen issues where, if you use it for the initial deployment, it might not deploy for several hours, and you're kind of wondering why. So it's not great for that, in my opinion. But for us, for example, we use policies for our initial deployment. And then afterward, we use app installers to kind of maintain those updates. So we had extreme success using app installers. Many of you are familiar with the overall process already, but in case you aren't, generally goes, you create your smart group, right? The criteria for ours is the bundle ID equals X, X being the bundle ID of the application that's installed on the endpoint. You want to keep up to date. That way it keeps the scope somewhat narrow. You add your app installer from the Jamf Pro catalog, and then you apply your scope. And then optionally, and hopefully, you're adding your patch software title too, right? Keep track of your patch metrics. That should kind of be a secondary metric for deployment success. That's what we use. But they're not without their share of problems, right? No technology is perfect. That includes app installers. So for example, there are 145 app installers available as of this morning, I think. More are being added all the time. How do you know when the catalog changes? So they're out there. How do you know? Are you going to babysit it the entire time? Are you going to set up a script just to check that website, compare it to a list you have? So that's one issue. Number 2 is, how do you know when you should deploy an app installer? Basically, is the juice worth the squeeze to do so? Would you consider installation prevalence? We do. Are you going to consider attack vectors with a low barrier to entry or with potentially critical impact? And then, are you going to consider app installers with a relatively minimal risk? Or is it going to introduce a lot of headaches later on that you're going to have to deal with? Because you're trying to solve a problem, you're not trying to introduce new ones, right? And then 3, once deployed, failures are practically unavoidable. There are a lot of moving parts with app installers. At the time of this presentation, app installers are still MDM dependent. They don't leverage the binary at all. And if they don't leverage the binary, that kind of leaves you with fewer options as far as like policies go and things like that to kind of keep them in check. So let's talk about deployment criteria. This is what we consider when we're deploying an app installer. And we consider how much of X is installed across your fleet. So if X is an application, for example, and it has a vulnerability that has relatively low potential for exploitation or impacts, but that application is installed on 90% of your systems across your fleet, your attack surface might be larger than you think, right? So it kind of helps kind of keep that in mind when you're considering vulnerability or vulnerability data across your fleet. This is particularly true of applications whose updates are easily circumvented. So you could probably do something about that to enforce those updates, absolutely true, but you still have to know what's installed where, right? So that's what I mean by installation prevalence. Another thing to consider is vulnerability density. So is there a particular application that contributes to a disproportionate number of vulnerabilities across your fleet? Are there applications that are commonly exploited? Things that attackers commonly take advantage of when they're trying to get to your end users and their constituent systems, right? So again, browsers. As far as browsers go, if you're in a situation where your environment is like browser homogeneous, so if you use a lot of Chrome, for example, Google Workspace might actually be a better option for that sort of thing because you can enforce updates on the endpoint, you provide a deferral, you provide a deadline for those updates for Chrome. But if your users like to experiment, they like to use Brave or Firefox or whatever else, app installers are a great thing to use just because it allows them to kind of use what they like, but it also puts the control back in your hands where you say, yeah, you could use that, but we're gonna keep it up to date for you, right? And then finally, again, is the app installer that you're gonna deploy relatively low risk? So this is more common earlier on. They've resolved a lot of these issues as far as like Teams and Chrome goes. But I think if you've used app installers for any appreciable amount of time, you might remember when they first came out, certain applications were getting bricked, right? Because the app installer and the application would fight to see who would update the application first. And in doing so, the application often resulted in a state where it was just broken, it had to be reinstalled. Luckily, Jamf is taking care of a lot of that these days. You have the option of like installing supported config profiles. That's an option through the API. We're gonna talk about that. But it's still something you have to consider. You know, if you're keeping up with, like, let's say Mac admins and the Jamf app installers channel, you might be aware of an app installer that contributes to a couple of headaches here and there. I think an example was Adobe Cloud. I think those applications are sometimes a little tricky to deal with. So it's just something to consider when you're deploying, right? So these are the overall workflows that we're gonna be talking about. For detection and suggestion, we're gonna start in Jamf. Even if you don't get that application data at runtime, and you actually receive that data via webhook or something like that, Jamf is still kind of your go-to for application inventory, at least it is for us. If you're considering an app installer and those are your targets, they might as well also be your source of truth and telling you like what's installed where, right? We're gonna process that data with tines, and we're gonna wind up in Slack. Slack, we're gonna use for like an approval-based mechanism. Configuration and deployment, we're actually gonna start in tines. We're gonna receive our answer from Slack. We're going to update the message in Slack, and we're gonna send it back to Jamf for configuration and deployment, right, of that app installer. Finally, maintenance and reporting. This last flow is actually independent of the other two, and you could kind of pick and choose what you like. You don't have to use all or nothing here, right? If you just want to, let's say, retry failed installations across your fleet at a regular cadence, you could absolutely just pick the third flow and be done with it if the other two are too risky or you're not really interested in doing that at this time. And as far as reporting goes, we'll touch a little bit on that, but that's also gonna vary by organization. We keep our patch data in our SIM, and we use it for reporting purposes and presentation of that data. But again, if you're just using the Jamf Pro dashboard, that's totally up to you. So I'm not gonna harp on that too much, but you'll see what I mean. These are the required privileges to make these automations work. This is true even if you use Jamf Pro's new API role in the client feature. I just started testing that out, and it's the privileges that you need are still applicable, right? So pretty self-explanatory. One note I'll say though is if you don't plan on leveraging the patch software titles, you obviously don't need those. That's not necessary to make the API or the app installer APIs work. But everything else is pretty non-negotiable. So, quick word about chat. Slack is entirely optional here. We talk about Slack because we use Slack. But if you use Teams, that's awesome. That's okay, just substitute, just rip out those parts and swap in what you do use. But if you do use Slack, the examples will make a little bit more sense. You might have experience interacting with the Slack API, and you'll kind of understand where these interactive elements are coming from, right? But Teams has their constituent components as well that correspond to Slack, so it's not going to make a huge difference. As far as approval goes, that's technically optional too. If you want an automation that's just completely hands-off and it just detects what's in your environment, it suggests, or it doesn't even suggest anything to you at that point, and just says, I'm going to configure this, I'm going to deploy it to a smart group that you told me to in advance that you want me to deploy it against, meaning your criteria is set up ahead of time and just based on the bundle ID, that's possible. I can't personally advocate for that. When it comes to automations, I always advocate for having hand on the wheel, even if it's just a simple notification. Because if you're just automating something and just letting it run and not monitoring it, you might run into a bad time. So just a heads up. So tines. I love talking about tines, but just a note, I'm just a fanboy. I don't work for tines. Anything I do or say up here, it's only representative of my thoughts and viewpoints, it's not theirs. A colleague once described tines as coding with flowcharts, which I think is very true. You can kind of see an example up there. And those are actually the flows that we use for detection, suggestion, configuration, and deployment. That's what it looks like. If you come from a programming background, much like somebody mentioned corresponding to the Okta workflows yesterday, you're probably going to take to it like a duck to water because you're going to be familiar with certain concepts already, like data types, iteration, consumption of APIs, things like that. But if you're not, please don't let that intimidate you at all. You don't necessarily need to be a coder to interact with tines or play with it. The learning curve is not super steep at all. And as a bonus, they have a community edition. So what that means is you create an account in Tines, you get 3 free stories to play with. An example of something you could do just on your own time is I built a fantasy football bot in Tines. I don't know anything about fantasy football, but I placed 3rd somehow. And that's just because it was a simple, guess and check work, right? But you can do something like that with Tines if you'd like. So here's an example story in Tines. The only confusing part really is the constituent workflows that you see up here, like the individual chains, those are also stories. The entire canvas that you build your stories in, that is technically a story as well. So it's kind of like a unit of measurement in 2 different ways. The building blocks you have webhooks, you have HTTP requests, you could send and receive email. You have the green, that's triggers. That acts as your if-else statements, right? So pretty self-explanatory. You have what's called event transforms. That will allow you to manipulate data. You could delay event propagation. You could explode and implode events. And what you do there is, so instead of looping or iterating over an array, you basically explode that array. You would operate on its constituent elements. And if you wanted to put it back together again, you would just implode it, right? You have resources in Tines. It allows you to achieve a sense of statelessness. And it's really easy once you think about it, because instead of writing something to disk, like you would do with a script, or you would write to an S3 bucket or something like that, you just do it to a resource. It could be plain text, it could be a certain data type if you'd like, it could be a file, pretty much whatever you want. Credentials. Credentials are essentially encrypted variables that your story has access to at runtime. A good way to think about credentials is like GitHub secrets. So a GitHub secret is available to a GitHub action at runtime, right? Same thing with Tines, so pretty easy. Quick note on HTTP actions and webhooks, incredibly useful. HTTP actions abstract a lot of repetitive code. So for example, like authentication, renewal of a bearer token, invalidation of that bearer token, that's all taken care of with a single header in an HTTP action. It's fantastic. Same thing with webhooks. Webhooks basically make deployment of infrastructure really easy. If you're looking at interactive elements with chatbots, things like that, they're invaluable, super, super helpful. And occasionally in Mac admins, I see somebody ask about like a client-based script and sending that information to Tines. Obviously, it's not a good idea to encode or embed credentials in your scripts. Webhooks allow you to achieve like a middleman type deal. So if you just send some data from that client to a webhook in Tines, you can actually have Tines pass that information on to Jamf Pro. So that allows you to get rid of your credentials in your scripts and just have that endpoint pass up whatever data you needed to pass up at that time without actually encoding or embedding anything, if that makes sense. Tenets of automation. This is sort of like guidelines that I use whenever I automate something. Safety is basically asking yourself, okay, I'm designing this thing. Is it going to lead to headaches after hours? Have you taken enough steps to say, yeah, this is going to run off the rails and wake me up at 2 a.m.? Is it sensible? And what I mean by that is, does the amount of time you're spending automating something make sense proportionate to the amount of time and effort that you're trying to save? An example of this would be something that you have to do every day, but it takes you a minute. But it takes you a month to automate it. Does it make sense? If you're learning a new programming language, I'd say yes, because that's an investment, right? So just something to think about. Security is probably the easiest question to answer. When you're designing something, just ask yourself, is it going to make my CISO sad? If the answer is yes, this will make my CISO pull his hair out or her hair out, maybe redesign what you're doing or rethink what you're doing, right? So detection and suggestion, again, we're going to start in Jamf. We're going to wind up in Slack. So first, we're going to take a look at our application inventory. It's what I consider to be the most important basis for suggestion. An accurate application inventory is honestly of absolute critical importance. Luckily, we can ask Jamf about that. I'll talk about that in a second. Second most important layer is what app installers are available to us, right? We're going to get that information by checking the Jamf Pro app catalog, which there is an API for. Next, we're going to get rid of our out of scope suggestions. So we don't really care about anything that's already deployed. Don't tell me about it, it's already out there. And then at MFP, we also maintain a list of ignored app installers. And these are usually the problem children that are going to cause us headaches, right? So for a little while, both Chrome and Teams were on that list because I said, yeah, we're not going to deploy these for the foreseeable future. There are just too many issues with them. So your app inventory. Again, if you're trying to decide what app installers to deploy, your target assets may as well be your source of truth for that. It just makes the most sense to me. You can retrieve or receive this information. If you're interested in retrieving it, meaning you're going to go out and get it at runtime, I have supplied some code to help you do that if you're interested in that strategy. But periodically receiving this data may be better suited for some orgs. You're ultimately going to be the ones to say what's right for you, right? But for example, your inventory might live in your SIM. If you're using Splunk, you could set up a scheduled report to email you a CSV, or you can just have it sent to you via a webhook. The catch with Splunk outgoing webhooks, though, is, and at least this is true 6 months ago, I think it is still true today, it will only send you your results of the first row. So a trick to getting around that is doing something ham-fisted like I did here, and just building your objects manually, and then cramming all those results into your first row. So it's still going to send you your first row, but that's going to be all your results anyway, right? And it's just going to look, once you parse it out at the endpoint, or the endpoint, it's going to look exactly like JSON anyway. So who cares? So we're going to see if, hopefully this plays. This is actually a detection and suggestion workflow. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to receive that application breakdown via webhook. We're going to process that data, and you're going to see there's going to be a bunch of event transforms in the intermediary. We're going to have a couple of triggers to check if it's going to be ignored or already deployed. We're going to have a trigger to check for installation prevalence. If it's over 25%, I believe we have. Then we're going to go ahead and pass on to Slack and say, yeah, go ahead. So again, we're doing a couple of explodes and implodes there. One is to kind of get all of our bundle IDs, and we use that as our like foreign and private keys, essentially. And we use those to check if it's in any one of the lists that we just talked about. But you can see we received an app installer suggestion in Slack, and there are 3 roads we could take. We could deploy, we could postpone, or we can ignore it. Okay, these are your pertinent endpoints. I wouldn't really worry about taking a picture or writing this down. I just have this for posterity, in case you need a quick reference if you're rewatching this or anything like that. But in the GitHub repo that I mentioned, all of these are written out, and you shouldn't have to go back and check this presentation over and over again. Configuration deployment. Again, we're going to start with tines. We're going to receive our answer from Slack via webhook. We're going to update our Slack message to indicate who did what in Slack, and then we're going to end up in Jamf, right? Jamf being where we're going to configure and deploy that app installer. So, quick note, again, receiving approval, optional. For us, it's not, it's a requirement. We only proceed here if a deployment is approved. If not, no action is taken at all. If no action is taken, obviously the message is an update, but if it's ignored or postponed, we also update the message to indicate who elected to do that. But we're gonna go ahead and once we receive approval, we're gonna go ahead and create our smart group. Again, that's gonna be scoped to where the application's bundle ID, is equivalent to, or the bundle ID equals that application's bundle ID essentially, right? So we're indicating that the application is installed on the endpoint. We're only scoping it to those endpoints. We're gonna add and configure our app installer. We're gonna configure it to say install automatically versus self-service, because that's a thing nowadays within the last few months. We're gonna go ahead and set our notification to remind the user to install an update every 24 hours. Please modify that configuration as you see fit. Again, it's gonna be what makes sense for your organization. You can enforce force closures if you'd like, but we get far by just annoying our end users, more or less. As long as we're persistent, we get them to update, and that's gonna be it's gonna be dependent on a good security culture as well, right? So educate your end users, they're gonna know what to do when they get that notification. Finally, we do add our patch software title. I stick on the dashboard to let me know what I care about. It's an easy way to just see what's on the dashboard at the time. That's a list of applications that I want to track via patch management, and I kind of go from there, right? It's just a very narrow list that I keep track of. Next, this is the actual configuration deployment story. You're going to see we're going to start in Slack. You're going to see the message update. We're going to go back to Tines. You're going to see the entire enchilada, how it runs through Tines, that entire workflow. You're going to see a couple of other branches off that main story for postponement and ignoring that app installer if we so choose. And then finally, we're going to wind up in Jamf. And you're going to actually see the smart group created. You're going to see the app installer created, or added rather, and configured. And we're going to go ahead and double check ourselves. The red dot there, that's checking if the smart group exists. It's technically hitting a 404 because it doesn't, right? And then we're just gonna go ahead and create it because we know it doesn't exist. So here's our scope. You can see it was created 3 minutes ago. Not doing this live, obviously. And then we're winding up, and that's our actual app installer. You can see we have install supporting configuration profiles checked. You can see it's scoped appropriately. I stick all of our app installers, if we deploy them this way, in an automatically configured category. You can go ahead and just change that as you see fit. But that's where we stick them in case we need to review and you say, oh, okay, this is how this wound up here. These are the other Slack messages that you might see. So postponement, if you choose to postpone, it's just gonna remind you again in a week. That's how often we have ours run. If you ignore it, it's not gonna suggest it again unless you remove it from that list. It's kind of like on a block list, and it says, yeah, I know I'm not supposed to suggest this to you, so I'm not going to. Again, pertinent endpoints, these are documented. I wouldn't waste too much time writing these down. Finally, maintenance and reporting. I think this is actually of interest for, I don't know if it's 50% or more. But I know in the Mac admin Slack, a lot of people just want to be able to retry failed installations periodically. That's huge for a lot of orgs because you don't want to go in there for 16 different app installers and click retry for each one, right? So maintenance and reporting. Again, failed deployments are nearly inevitable. I feel like they are going down as time goes on and app installers improve. But there are an appreciable number of moving parts with app installers to this day. And maybe that'll improve with what we've seen with Sonoma and all that, but that's the state of the union today. So what you can do and what we do is we get our app installers, we parse for any failed deployments, and we go ahead and just hit a retry. We do that a few times a week. And our metrics reflect that. They've improved considerably since we implemented that mechanism. Reporting, again, why do I add a software title to the dashboard? It just lets me know what I care about. If I add a patch software title but I don't stick it on there, maybe I just want a quick glance of what's installed where. That's another great way to do it. But I treat anything that's on the dashboard as in scope for patch management and reporting. Same thing. So finally, code, automation, and app installers, right? So what I provided are these workflows rewritten in Python. They cover detection, suggestion, configuration, deployment, and maintenance. I don't cover patch management as far as getting that data to where you care about it because it's going to vary so widely. What's not provided is any warranty or guarantee. It's not an out-of-the-box experience. You have to set up your own infrastructure and things like that. How and where you deploy is up to you. If I were in the audience, I would probably go with an AWS approach just because that's with what I'm most familiar. Kind of makes sense to me, but that's going to depend on you, right? And then please trust but verify. I'm basically a stranger on the internet that you just met. I know we've gotten really close over like these past 30 minutes. We're practically best friends. Don't just trust me that I've coded this correctly. That is an example of something that would make your CISO sad. You'd be like, where did you get this? And you're gonna be like, my buddy Tyler. And they're gonna be like, who's Tyler? Why did you do this? So check it out. Make sure you understand it before you implement. But hopefully what I've written kind of gets you 90% of the way there. Quick disclaimer. This is kind of the bummer. As of today, the endpoints required to interact with app installers, they're all undocumented. So these are things that I've stumbled upon and have figured out via like developer tools, via browsers. I've interacted with the GUI, I've seen what requests are being passed, and I've built out these automations from there. So they should be handled with a certain level of additional care. Just know that if something goes wrong, take appropriate measures, and understand that this is still uncertain territory for us, right? So just take precautions. Now, with that being said, our deployments have required zero babysitting for over a year now. I don't check when a new app installer is available because my automation handles that for me. Our automations also let me know if the juice is worth the squeeze considering a deployment. I don't go and pour over the app catalog because I know exactly what's available. I know it's reflective of what's installed in our environment, so there's really no guessing there, right? So if I haven't steered you off, please weigh the risks, dip your toes in the water, and with everything else, decide what's appropriate for organization and kind of go from there, right? These are helpful resources. So the repo I would definitely write down. That's where all my documentation lives for app installers right now. I took a stab at writing an open API spec for the app installer endpoints. It's not really there because the schema for the responses isn't defined yet, but you could still use that if you'd like. And that's also where all the code lives in the automations folder. And with that being said, that's it. Thank you again, guys. Thank you so much for coming out. I really, really appreciate it. It's been a great time.
Okay, thank you, Tyler. Now it's time for the Q&A. So feel free to submit it through the app, or you can ask it directly. Currently, there are no questions available online, so feel free to go.
Even if it's a question about fantasy football. I can't help you out very much, but.
Oh, here we go. Oh no, please provide the replay video. Right, that's not a question.
Say again, I'm sorry.
request to reply to provide a replay.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
Okay.
Cool.
So can we get another round of applause for Tyler?
Thanks a lot, guys.